Alright guys, Murph's here, and today we're going to talk about this, a Swiss K31 chambered in 7.5 by 55 millimeter Swiss. Now before we get into this rifle, guys, I do want to go ahead and lead off with some caveats. This is going to be a pretty long review. I'm going to spend a lot of time in the history section of this as well as the features, because this is a very feature-rich rifle. So with that being the case, if there's any particular portion of this in which I'm taking a really long time, go ahead and check the description. There will be chapters laid out there, and you guys go ahead and hop to content that you actually want to consume. All right, so with that, why don't we go ahead and get into the history of this particular rifle. Now, the original design for this originated in 1889 by two gentlemen named Schmidt and Rubin, of which their names would be applied to the rifle, as was the trend at the time for people contributing designs to the military. Now, these two would come up with the full system that would include the action as well as the cartridge. Now, the design would see some changes up until about 1911, in which case they would standardize on a rifle configuration that would be the standard Swiss military rifle going into World War I. However, for that war, Switzerland was neutral, so it did not necessarily see a lot of frontline combat use. However, Switzerland was still paying attention, and in the interwar period, they would follow the trend of many other militaries who did get frontline combat service in World War I and make some changes to their pattern. Now, by this time, Schmidt and Rubin were dead, so the redesign of the 1911 variant of their rifle would fall to a man named Adolf Führer. It was decided that the Swiss wanted to follow the interwar period trend of going with a short rifle pattern. Now, what is a short rifle? Well, going into World War I, a lot of militaries had two different weapons patterns. They had a long rifle that was used by the infantry, and then they had a carbine that was used by cavalry, as well as guys with frontline battle duties that didn't necessarily involve direct fire engagements with rifles. So this would be like artillerymen or engineers, guys who were close enough to the fighting that they would probably still need to defend themselves at some point, especially if things went awry, but not so close that they were actually expected to be exchanging gunfire during the conduct of their other duties. Some militaries would even have two different carbine variants, one that was specialized for cavalry and one that was specialized for engineers or artillerymen or whoever it was that were using it. Now, the issue with this was that as these militaries went into World War I, they very quickly found that they could not supply the necessary amount of rifles to everybody. And the issue became that the war of attrition in World War I covered a lot more than just men. It was also incredibly taxing on materials, which made logistics incredibly difficult. Now, a lot of people leverage a lot of accusation against these militaries going into World War I. Why were they not more cognizant of this potentially being an issue? And what it comes down to is that there had never been a war like World War I. There had been global conflicts previously, but not nearly to the scale of World War I, where you might send a regiment into a battle and within 15 minutes, 400 guys were dead and no meaningful shift had occurred in the front lines one way or the other. So it wasn't just a matter of those 400 guys died, well, now we need 400 replacements in order to be able to keep the front line doing what it is that it needs to be doing. Those men died with their equipment, and that equipment is now in no man's land. And it's called no man's land for a reason, because it is constantly being raked by machine gun fire or plastered with artillery barrages and stuff like that. So it's not even just a matter of like, that those men and equipment are left out there, but you're not getting that equipment back, not in a good, ready-to-use state. It's going to get mashed in the mud. It's going to get pressed into the ground. The stock is going to be splintered. At best, you might get a gun that eventually, should you recapture that ground, you might get some guns that you're able to send back to the depots in order to get serviced and brought to a serviceable state. But for the most part, those guns are gone. 100% gone. And this really stressed the industrial capacity of these nations during that time period, especially if you consider that their industrial capabilities were split between several different rifle patterns. Ultimately, the infantry on the front line need their guns, but everyone else in the rear, depending on how big a breakout could be, could also wind up being on the front line very quickly. So everyone still needs guns, but not everyone has the same requirements for guns. So one of the great things about carbines and stuff like that is those could be provided to rear echelon troops rear echelon infantry in order to move those guns from those guys up to the front. But eventually those rear echelon guys were going to get rotated out to the front. They were going to need rifles. So that was kind of a case of like robbing Peter to pay Paul, which when you're talking about total war on that global of a scale, there's a certain amount of that when it comes to logistics. There's a reason logistics are important to warfare. So, whenever we're talking about the difference between all these different patterns, an 18 to 20 inch barrel is what you're roughly expecting for a carbine. 22 to 24, possibly as long as 26 inches is what you're going to see in a short rifle, and then a long rifle or a rifle is going to be anything longer than 26 inches. Now, most militaries in the interwar period would go to a short rifle pattern, as mentioned before. In this way, they would be able to refine production. Now everyone's using the same gun. The cavalry has a gun that's a little bit longer than a carbine, but it's still not necessarily a full-length rifle. And the infantry have something that's a little bit shorter and lighter, which they're not going to complain about, but it still has the capabilities of a rifle because there have been advancements in propellants at this point that you're not really losing that much velocity by going with a shorter barrel. They're still able to do long-range fires of whatever variety that they might actually need to do with a short rifle pattern. Excuse me. Now, the Swiss would have to take a much deeper look at the 1911. Adolf Fuhrer actually had a lot more work cut out for him in that, because if you actually look at the layout of the original Schmidt-Reuben rifle, it's actually quite stretched out. The magazine is set way forward. The chamber is set way forward of where like the trigger and the pistol grip are located at, or the grip are located at. And it's actually a design that reminds me a lot more of like early semi-automatic rifles, like a Gewehr 41 or a Tokarev SVT 38, even the SKS, where it's a very stretched out design for some reason. It's not terribly size efficient. Adolf Fuhrer would set about shortening the action and the barrel, making a more compact rifle overall out of the original 1889 design. Now, this would be the primary rifle of the Swiss military going into World War II, where they were yet again neutral. Now, a lot of people leverage criticism at Switzerland for remaining neutral during both world wars. However, it's actually not an envious position to be neutral, because if you joined one side or the other, you would have allies, and as long as your allies weren't the Italians, you could pretty much rely on them to have your back. At least that would be the plan. When you're neutral, you're kind of against everybody. Potentially, you're not actively fighting anybody, but you have to be concerned that somebody's going to come and jump you. Now, as far as I know, the Allies had no designs on invading Switzerland because they were not bent on world domination, unlike the Nazis, who most definitely had interest in invading Switzerland. They had plans drawn up to do so. And in general, Switzerland was also doing kind of its own side thing and all that kind of stuff, and had agreements with both the Allies and the Axis, but that's kind of, you know, I don't necessarily want to get into World War II global politics at this point. It's not really in the purview of this channel, as much as to address that neutrality is a hard thing to maintain in a worldwide conflict like that. Now, of course, Switzerland would never enter the fighting, and these rifles would never fire a shot in anger. In about 1958, these rifles would be replaced by the Sturmgewehr 57, and these would pretty much fade into the background, disappearing into arsenals to be held as war reserve up until the 1990s. However, not all of them went into war reserve. For some of you who do not know, the Swiss National Guard actually get the opportunity to take their rifles home in order to be able to maintain their proficiency and all that kind of stuff. And this is largely linked to the fact that Switzerland actually has a very rich shooting culture, unlike anything else that you'll find in Europe. Now, also, those exiting service would have the opportunity to be able to purchase their rifles. So some of these rifles were already in private hands well before the 1990s when they were released on the surplus market. Now, of course, in the 90s, already you were seeing a lot of guns coming out on the surplus market. We were getting the Berlin Wall was falling, communism was coming to an end, and pretty soon there was going to be an absolute deluge of rifles and handguns coming onto the market. These guns would kind of get lost in the lurch because only about 528,000 of these were produced, which when you compare that to Mosin Nagants, which were produced in the millions, it's pretty easy to see how these kind of got overshadowed, especially when those Nagants were going for about $100. However, eventually supply of these would run out, and it's pretty difficult to find these in an original like distributor type format. These are pretty much only on the private market at this point. All right, guys, I think that pretty much covers history. Why don't we go ahead and get into the features of this particular rifle? Right off the bat, we have a 25.5-ish inch barrel, which is putting it at a little bit longer side of the short rifle pattern. However, it is still an overall pretty compact rifle. Our front sight is a blade type front sight with protective ears. I'll try to set this in such a way that you guys can see that. There they are. And the protective ears on this are actually quite interesting. Whenever I think of protective ears, I think more of like an M1917 or an M16A2 pattern front sight where the protective ears curve out. These curve in and kind of evoke an image in my head of like a hooded front sight. However, it is not fully enclosed, which I appreciate because those have a tendency to kind of channel you into a corridor whenever it is that you're viewing through your sights. These are much more open, more applicable to combat style shooting, in my opinion. We'll talk about that more once we get into the shooting portion of this. Now, in addition to that, windage adjustment on this rifle is actually done in a very interesting way. You see, instead of just being able to drift it from side to side, your windage adjustment is actually done by drifting the sight forward because we have this angled slot cut into the front sight that allows this, as you drift it forward, to go either left or right, depending on if you're drifting it forward or back. That's a very interesting way to do the sights on this. I am curious as to what drove them to do that instead of just a standard left to right drift adjustment like every other front sight used during this time period would have used. Here on the front of the rifle, we have a stacking rod. This was used in order to, if you and your buddies have got like some non-combat duties going on, you've got to do some camp chores or in place of howitzer or something along those lines, you would be able to stack your rifles so that they're not lying in the mud or something along those lines. Now off the bottom here, we have a bayonet lug, and I also happen to have the proper bayonet for this rifle, which is a sword type bayonet, double-edged, over 11 inches long. I massively prefer sword type and knife style bayonets over socket type bayonets. This is handy to me because if for some reason I didn't have my rifle but I still had my bayonet, I at least have a good fighting knife. As opposed to if I have a socket type bayonet where I have just this really crappy thing that's better than throwing rocks at that point, which I don't know, it might actually be better to throw rocks. Kind of depends on the individual person. Yes, I absolutely love this bayonet. It's in excellent condition. And surprisingly sharp. All right, now something else that I find interesting about this rifle is how they did the stock bands. So as we can see here, as we look at it, this stock band here, which actually has our sling swivel, which we'll talk about more here in a minute, is a compression type. So you tighten the screw and then that tightens the stock band. A lot of other times when you see stock bands, you'll see press fit or perhaps something that has like a spring detent or something like that that keeps it in place. On our front barrel band here, we actually have a hinged clasp type, which is interesting. I mean, this is kind of multi-function to begin with because it has my stacking rod, my bayonet lug, and then also this very secure clasp type manner of attaching itself. But this required a lot of additional work, which could have been done more simply, but probably not as secure as this arrangement is. All right, now you can see that we have full hand guards, which is pretty handy if you are potentially going to have to actually do some bayonet practice or, you know, actual bayonet fighting, and you fired your rifle a bunch. This is going to keep you from burning your fingies in the middle of combat. Original stocks would be walnuts, but all of them at the arsenal would be replaced to beech stocks. So it's very rare to see walnut stocks on these rifles. Our sling swivels are side set, and this is actually an original sling. It did not come with a rifle, but I did manage to find this off of like Liberty Tree Collectors or something like that. I actually prefer side-mounted sling swivels just because I feel like I get the rifle closer to my body, but you know, to each their own on that. Now our rear sight is tangent adjustable out to 1,500 meters, which this is where most YouTubers would tell you that that's a very optimistic distance to engage with iron sights on an enemy in the open. Which they're absolutely right. You would have some issue trying to identify a target at 1,500 meters with the naked eye. This is not what this is. This is not meant for engaging a single guy out in the open at 1,500 meters. This is meant for doing volley type fire. Now, volley fire is when you would get a squad, platoon, company, battalion, whatever sized element together in order to set elevation on your sights and suppress an enemy position with rifle fire. This was something that was supposed to be if you didn't have enough machine guns around, because this is normally a task that would be accomplished by machine guns, or if you needed more firepower than what your machine guns could actually amass. So the idea here is not necessarily to engage single point targets as much as it is to engage area type targets. And it's actually a concept that you still kind of see in militaries today, not so much in being able to cascade long range fire on the enemy, but having a full auto or burst selector on an M4 or M4A1, depending on which one it is that you have. That was meant for a situation in which you either didn't have any machine guns available or you didn't have enough machine guns available. You could turn everybody into a machine gunner, and you get enough of those guys together, they can amass the same amount of firepower as like an M249. It's not meant to replace an M249. It's just meant to be a suitable substitute should the situation cause that to happen. That is more or less what's going on here. You can do suppressive fire with these rifles at long range with these sights. Now, the rear sight notch is a U-shape, which makes it fairly easy to pick up those sights. We'll talk about it more once we get into the shooting portion. Now, set into our stock, we have these finger grooves here, which actually, if you notice, they are offset. And this is so that it better accommodates a right-handed shooter. Here I have my fingers inlaid on this side, and then my thumb runs in the groove on this side. So this is actually incredibly ergonomic if I'm shooting from a prone position or something along those lines, unless you're left-handed, in which case it really doesn't do a whole lot for you. So I actually really like that. Normally, whenever you see finger grooves cut like that, they are parallel to one another. But that's kind of an interesting little feature, and it really calls back to the idea that this rifle was built to be a precision rifle, a competition marksman style rifle, which, you know, as Americans, I think we can definitely appreciate that concept. Just look at the 1903, and really even the Krag Jorgensen to some extent. Now, on top of our chamber, we have the Swiss cross. And you will not necessarily find dates stamped on these barrels as much as you have to look at serial numbers. So this is actually a 1940 produced rifle. Now, this is a straight pull design, of which there have not been that many straight pull bolt action rifles ever designed. This is one of the few that also made it into military service. However, I would argue that this is probably one of the best of the examples. So we can see that we have our handle here set on the side. Originally, the knob here would be made from bakelite. However, with the K31, they went over to aluminum, the keg as it's referred to. So you can see here that keg mounts to a lever that runs on the side of the bolt. We actually have a bolt takedown lever right here, mounted on the side of the rifle. And now we can see our bolt. So we can see how that lever matches on the side. Now, a lot of people complain that it takes quite a bit of weight, like quite a bit of pressure in order to be able to pull this bolt. And it does, for sure. However, once it gets moving, this thing is moving. It is very fast, very smooth moving bolt. Now, we can also see in here that we have kind of a zigzag slot located right there, which is all part of the unlocking of this bolt. And our bolt is left in the white. This is incredibly well machined. Now, our follower is a last shot hold open follower, so we can see right there. A lot of people get surprised. They have a tendency to think of last shot hold open as like a more modern adaptation in tactical rifles and all that kind of stuff, but militaries have long benefited from making sure that their soldiers know their gun is empty. There have been plenty of circumstances in combat where dudes were 100% convinced that they were shooting their gun the whole time, and they've been out of ammo for a while. Actually, if you even look back at the American Civil War, there was quite a few times where rifles were recovered off of the battlefield that had been loaded multiple times, but the guys were forgetting to put the primers on. So they couldn't tell the difference between everyone else shooting and them shooting. They were probably looking away when they fired anyway. And their adrenaline was such that they didn't even feel recoil at that point. So they'd wind up loading it 8 times and never putting a primer on it. Obviously, you want that to be avoided in whatever combat situation you potentially have troops getting involved. So last shot hold open followers have been a long-term thing. This is a 6-shot capacity, kind of interesting. You do have the ability to be able to remove the magazine by a little button right here. Kind of reminds me of the French Mas 49. However, this was not meant to be used as a detachable box magazine. This is purely meant for disassembly. This is not meant to be the way that you conduct your reloads. Magazines at this time are really expensive to produce. But stripper clips or chargers or M-block clips and stuff like that are very cheap. So if you are sending a guy out there with a bunch of magazines and stuff like that, especially if you want reliable magazines, they are incredibly expensive. You send them out the door with 5-6 magazines and they drop all their magazines on the ground during the course of the battle. Now you've got to build new magazines. Like it's an expensive prospect that you have to keep resupplying. In addition to that, retained magazines, like even today, there are guys out there who make sure that they train to drop their magazines, their expended mags, into a dump pouch or something like that. Because if you're out on the battlefield and you don't have any magazines and you're out of ammo, your ammunition's gonna get brought out to you in a can. That's not preloaded into magazines. So if you don't have any mags to put that ammo in, you've got a single shot. That's not a good place to be. Now, this rifle would run off of chargers instead of the Mauser patented stripper clips. And these chargers would actually come preloaded in the box with 6 rounds and were made out of like a cardboard or something along those lines. Now, those, of course, are kind of difficult to find. They haven't necessarily held up to modern production techniques. So what I managed to find were these plastic ones, which at first when I got them, I have to admit I was a little sus because they look kind of flimsy. And I can even see where they deformed a little bit in the time that I've had them thrown in with the rest of my magazines, which I keep in a box in my gun room. However, I have used these and I've had 0 issue with them. As soon as you put rounds into them, they form the shape that they're supposed to be in. Now, what I have found is that when you're loading this rifle, see, it does take a little bit of energy to get that thing moving. Whenever it is that you're loading this rifle, it's easier to rock the rear of the charger in first than it is to try to get it from the front. It's kind of like a rock and lock magazine in that sense, but obviously it doesn't lock and it's not a magazine. So then you can feed your rounds in. You do have to remove the charger. It's not like on a stripper clip where you can just go ahead and run the bolt and it'll get out of your way. All right, so this pull ring here on the back that you guys have seen me probably mess with a couple of times there, this is actually connected to your striker. So we can manually cock that. It is also a cocking indicator, so you know that the rifle is cocked. And then also, this is your safety. So all you have to do is pull it out, rotate it, and now the weapon is on safe. And if you want to go back to fire, now the weapon can be fired. You can also cock this if you're doing dry fire practice or if you need a second strike on a primer, something along those lines. All right, our trigger. This trigger is ridiculously good. I'm just going to go ahead and tell you that right off the bat. So, this is a 2-stage trigger. It has a very light and easy take up to the wall, and then just a teensy bit more pressure, and you're through it. This is a 2-stage in that there are most definitely 2 very distinct motions made by the trigger, but it's really kind of a single stage in how it is that it lets off. This is the best trigger I've ever felt on a military surplus rifle. And in general, like I train a lot around like mil-spec triggers on like AR-15s and stuff like that, because I don't really consider myself a trigger snob. So this trigger really throws me off whenever I'm trying to shoot for like accuracy and all that kind of stuff, because it's much lighter than what I initially think it's going to be. This is an absolutely fantastic trigger. I love this trigger. Now we do have a semi-pistol grip worked into the stock here, which has this very nice hook to it. I love the semi-pistol grip for being able to pull the rifle securely into my shoulder. Very much more so than the English style stock. Now you'll note that we have an X on the buttstock here. This is to indicate that this has been taken out of Swiss military service. And then we also have a steel butt pad on the back here, which is left in the white. All right, guys, that's features. How does it shoot? Absolutely fantastic. So, right off the bat, recoil. Relatively light. I did find in some of my shooting, especially as I like really got down on my shooting bag and all that kind of stuff, my shooting bag is kind of empty, so it put the rifle a little bit higher up on my shoulder towards my collarbone than it probably needed to be, and there I felt more recoil. But as I've shot more erect, I haven't necessarily felt as much recoil whenever it is I'm shooting this rifle. So that I greatly appreciate. Now the sights on this rifle. So one of the issues that I mentioned before with like hood type sights is that it can really narrow your vision into a corridor. However, if your protective wings, which are very important for, military style rifles, if they're too vertical, you might mistake those for your front sight post and potentially really have your shots going wild there. Now, for the average shooter of these rifles today who's not necessarily in combat situations, it's unlikely that they would misread their sights and wind up focusing on one of the protective wings over the actual central blade. But in combat, you could definitely run into that being an issue. There's really no possibility of me doing that. The wings sit in such a way that you can see the curvature right above the rear sight, which allows you to know that you are for sure exactly where it is that you're supposed to be. And they also kind of provide almost like barriers or bumpers in order to get your eye to where that front sight's supposed to be. Now the U-notch makes it very easy. It's just wide enough to be able to pick up that front sight, but I can still focus on it enough to be able to take more precise shots. So for this style of sight arrangement, there's actually a really great balance between being able to get drawn in on your target and really pick it out perfectly, but also quickly acquire those sights for a combat, close range combat type purpose. So I do really appreciate these sights quite a bit. Now, something that to talk about with Swiss sights and how they were classically zeroed was supposed to be that you would hold dead hold at 100 and 200 meters in order to be able to get that center mass impact. And then at 300 meters, you're supposed to go to a 6 o'clock hold just below the target. The point of that was to be able to read your impacts so that you can make adjustments for those greater distances. Now, of course, we are not in the Swiss Army. It is not the 1940s. You can zero this rifle any way that you please. It's just that is what you should maybe take into consideration if you're wanting to like really either get to the historical aspect of it, or if you hadn't considered the fact that a 6 o'clock hold might make it easier for you to be able to read impacts at distance. That way you're not looking through your sights, you're looking over your sights to be able to see the impacts, ideally. Now, I didn't say that this rifle shoots very left, and I pretty much had to hold on the right corner of the target in order to be able to shoot some groupings. Now, speaking of groupings, right now I have, as the time of this filming, I have just one target. By the time I post this video, I might have more, and I will roll them in as well. But the first grouped target that I shot with this was at 100 yards with 174 grain soft points from PPU, and I got this 4 3/4 inch grouping. It's not the best grouping that I've ever shot with a military surplus rifle, but it's pretty good overall when you consider its iron sights and PPU ammunition and stuff like that. It's not Swiss GP11, which was considered to be absolutely fantastic ammunition. Like sniper grade ammunition in any other military was just the standard normal ammunition that was issued out for this rifle. Now, of course, I don't have any of that. All I have is like PPU and other types of, like Graf & Sons, other types of post-production ammunition. So we kind of got what we got. I'm sure this rifle is capable of better accuracy. I hope to be able to roll in more targets in the future. Now, when it came to cycling the bolt, this thing absolutely flies. Like when you're actually trying to cycle the bolt and all that kind of stuff, this is very smooth. And a lot of people would put this on par with like a Lee Enfield. However, I would disagree with that. The thing with the Lee Enfield is that you have a turned down bolt handle, which allows you to be able to operate it with your thumb and forefinger while using your middle finger to fire the rifle. A lot of that has to do with the fact that the bolt handle deposits you right by the trigger, so that's very easy to work. Here, it would be a little bit more complicated to try to do that same thing. Not impossible, but not nearly as easy as it would be if this bolt handle was turned down. So while fast, I don't necessarily think it's ergonomically set up to be as fast as a Lee Enfield, and that's not a bad thing. The Mad Minute is an interesting, feat of capability or feat of skill, but I don't think it was necessarily like a pivotal aspect of British warfighting during either World War. All right, guys, that's shooting. What are my recommendations when it comes to this rifle? Would I recommend this for a duty rifle of some sort? Absolutely not. This thing is incredibly outdated. This doesn't really have accommodations for mounting optics. You could put a diopter sight in order to improve these iron sights, but there's no real optics capability or ability to add lights and lasers and all those types of things that you might need as a professional of some sort utilizing this rifle in a professional sense. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend it for that unless I absolutely had to. Would I recommend this as a self-defense, home defense type rifle? It would kind of depend on where you live. Honestly, once again, we don't really have the ability to add optics, lights, lasers, and all that type of stuff. But also, this is a pretty potent cartridge. And if you're living in a suburban or urban area, you're probably going to cause some issues if you actually have to use this in a self-defense situation. I don't think your neighbors are looking to be collateral damage as you try to keep somebody from stealing your toaster. So no, I would not necessarily recommend it for that. Not saying I wouldn't use it, I'm just saying that I wouldn't recommend it. What about as a competition rifle? Well, that depends, because in military surplus rifle type competitions in Australia, Canada, Switzerland, and the United States, these are actually still very popular rifles. And I could understand that immensely. These are a lot of fun to shoot, and when GP11 ammunition was more available, absolute joy to get the accuracy out of these. Doesn't mean that they're still not accurate rifles, just means that you might have to spend a little bit more time trying to dial them in now. So for that type of competition, absolutely. But if you're talking about like 3-gun competition and you're actually trying to be competitive, I would not recommend this rifle. I'll tell you that right off the bat. Okay, well, what about as a hunting rifle? Well, this is actually still a very popular hunting rifle in Europe and other places. I remember when I was living in Germany and I was looking for a hunting rifle after having gotten my license, these were actually still available from some surplus vendors. Now, that was 6 years ago, so I'm sure that's not necessarily the case anymore, but it is something to take into account if you were looking for a little bit more challenge in your hunting. Of course, a lot of that also comes back to being able to make sure that you're taking ethical shots with and very honest with yourself about your ability to be able to engage out to what distances ethically with this rifle. Okay, well, what are my uses for this rifle then? This is a collector's piece to me, and this is exactly what I would recommend this rifle be used for. Now, some people do not have a lot of interest in this rifle because it never fired a shot in anger. It was not used in any of the world wars. But there's a benefit to that as well, because these rifles are in fantastic shape. Sure, they got used for training and all that kind of stuff, and they were shot frequently, I'm sure, so they've probably at different times been rebarreled. There might be some dings in the stock and all that kind of stuff. This most definitely has some evidence of that. But they're not, when they were released on the market, they were not necessarily released in a shot-out configuration. These rifles never hit a point in the war where they had to be refined in order to be able to keep up with demand for wartime production, which pretty much every other participant, every active participant in World War II had to do to some extent. The M1 Garand wound up having more of its parts refined. The rear sight was redesigned. There was more stamped parts that were utilized. The 1903A3, which previously reviewed on the channel, link in the description, the 1903A3 exists because there was a whole bunch of production refinements that were made in order to be able to more quickly produce that. So it didn't necessarily match up with the 1903 of any previous vintage. And then also you have the last-ditch weapon systems, like the Sten would eventually become a last-ditch weapon system. Earlier Stens and then later Stens were very refined. They would start to incorporate wood stocks and all that kind of stuff. But there was a time where a Sten looked like it was assembled in somebody's garage, and that's because it probably was. If you look at Mauser Nagants, there are last-ditch versions of the Mauser Nagant. Mauser 98Ks, the air soccer rifles are renowned for the appearance of the last-ditch rifles. These never got that. So this kind of maybe needlessly complicated front sight arrangement where you drift it forward in order to get left to right to affect your windage, that stuck around the entire life of production. This clasp type setup and single piece construction for your bayonet lug and your stacking rod and all that kind of stuff, that maintained its appearance on the rifle. This bolt system, all of these little features on this gun are here throughout the production life of this gun because it never went to war. So you actually get a far better quality rifle for your money. So for the amount of money that I paid for this in the condition that it's in, I would have to have paid double for a 1903A3. I got this for less than $700. That is incredibly difficult to beat when you consider how fantastic the condition of this rifle is. Now the bluing is a little beat up, and there's some signs of pitting and stuff like that that I'm actively working against right now. But when it comes to how well this shoots, how well this cycles, the condition of the bore and all that kind of stuff, this rifle is pristine in comparison to what I would get paying the same money if I was trying to buy a 1903 A3 or an M1917 Enfield, so on and so forth. You can't beat these if you're looking for an actual shooter. And there's still, as our very lengthy history section indicated, there's still some history and discussion to be had surrounding these rifles. All right, guys, I think that pretty much covers my thoughts on this particular subject. I hope you guys found this interesting, and that's pretty much what I got. Have a good day.